In the late 20th century, hostile forces inside the United States grow strong. The city of Los Angeles is ravaged by crime and immorality. To protect and defend its citizens, the United States police force is formed.
Some of the recent protests against police violence and racism have been met with a federal response.
Los Angeles Island is declared no longer part of the United States and becomes the deportation point for all people found undesirable or unfit to live in the new moral America.
More federal law enforcement, that I can tell you. In Portland, they've done a fantastic job. These are anarchists. These are not protesters. People say protesters. These people are anarchists. These are people that hate our country.
An earthquake measuring 9.6 on the Richter scale hits at 12:59 p.m., August 23rd, in the year 2000.
Okay, hello friends, I'm Arnold Schroeder, and this is Fight Like an Animal. You can find the bibliography for this and all other episodes of the podcast at againsttheinternet.com. And obviously, you should find me on social media, follow my pretty occasional antics on Facebook and Twitter. Links for all that in the show description. And another thing that you can find at againsttheinternet.com soon, this is the project that I'm working on right now, is a sort of like, I don't know, I guess a glossary or a list of very concise statements that emerge from far more elaborate statements that have been made on the podcast. So, you know, for instance, if I spent all of episode 1 trying to justify the statement that there are innate differences between people that map out to the left-right divide, and that involved a lot of like complex argumentation and citations of scientific research. I obviously don't want to recapitulate all of a podcast if I ever want to refer back to that, and so I'm just trying to like collapse some fairly complex notions into some fairly simple terms. I feel like it feels like a little bit pretentious, but this is a totally inevitable, I think, facet of progressing through a body of theory that's actually integrated, that actually like builds on the foundation that it establishes as it goes. Is like at some point you have to be able to like be establishing some terms that summarize complex areas of material that you've already covered. And so, you know, I'm trying to create a nomenclature that I can use as I go through all this stuff, and then, you know, I can be like, and by principle 1.4d or whatever, we know that aggression is correlated with variation in political outlook, that sort of thing. It's a fun project, I think, especially because a lot of the time with evolutionary theory, examining human behavior in terms of cross-cultural universals and things like that, you get to a point where you can actually make really simple, concise statements that feel a lot like common sense to a lot of people. I think that's one of the tragedies of social science, is that people love to be dazzled. They love the counterintuitive result, and academia in general is very burdened by that, by the like perceived mandate to produce results that are counterintuitive and shocking. And so I'm proud of that project, because I also just find that ultimately, you know, I say this over and over again, that this podcast might seem really academic on one level, but that it ultimately really is motivated by the realities of politics that I've experienced and the barriers, like deep stories that we started telling ourselves a long time ago, that and like the effects that those stories have had that are reverberating out through the generations. And so it's nice to see that all the work that I'm doing can, I think, be like summarized into something that is like simple and easy to communicate to a lot of different kinds of people who aren't self-selected into any particular like specialized mode of analysis or information subculture or what have you. So be on the lookout for that. And I guess this is like maybe to make it going even a little more broad. When you're at the point where you're defining a lot of terms, you're like, well, here's my lengthy analysis, and then here's the like concise term that characterizes that point I just made in the lengthy analysis. I guess the question is, are you establishing like a school, in the sense that there's like anarcho-syndicalism and individualist anarchism, or like Marxist-Leninism as opposed to Maoism or whatever. I think that on some level, all of those schools of thought I just described essentially do start with the observation that there is no human nature. They all have this infinite plasticity of human behavior as a core premise. This is maybe like more explicit in Marxist thought, but if you read a book like Demanding the Impossible, The History of Anarchism, you do find that early anarchist thinkers all pretty much articulated this premise as well, I guess with the very notable exception of Kropotkin, who talked about the evolutionary basis of cooperation, sort of an antithetical approach, asking maybe instead of maybe there's no human nature, maybe human nature is the basis around which we should organize our societies. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know what I would call it, and I don't really know. I think that things could be potentially gained and lost by trying to define what I'm saying in like a formal set of axioms with like a formal theory around them. But it could be fun. Like when I actually think about it, I think of all the people on Twitter debating the obscure subgenres of different political philosophies, and I get like a little moment of glee out of imagining adding my own terminology to that mix. I don't know. So today we are doing part 2 of what I guess is going to be a 4-part series, Nature, Nurture, Death Spiral, and we're talking about cross-cultural universals. We're talking about what they mean, what they imply about us, and then how they can be a basis for assessing what's possible for human societies and organizing towards better rather than worse forms of human society. And again, this may seem profoundly academic on one level, but what I'm arguing, what I hope to illustrate in this series, is that a failure to incorporate an understanding of what we all have in common has not just been like a matter of people who come into social movements having variation in some ultimate scheme of what like the final great version of society should look like after the massive, transfiguration of humanity and the end of history, etc. It's not just about like versions of utopia that people have in their heads. It also has really been a profound influence on what it's like to have conversations about taking immediate action, on the extent to which it's possible to form alliances and it's possible to maintain them. Because after all, again, human universals, cross-cultural universals are about what we all have in common, and unity versus divisiveness is truly the axiomatic variable that determines whether social movements accomplish anything or don't. All variation in political outlook ultimately really does come down to variation in assessments of human nature. And in particular, what I think I would say about a lot of different political perspectives is that their tendencies to emphasize some aspects of human nature over others, right? So if you want a society based on mutual aid and cooperation, you tend to emphasize those aspects of human nature, and they are there, which orient towards those modes. And if you want to build prisons and border walls, you tend to orient towards the aspects of human nature that are rapacious, destructive, and greedy. It can certainly be true that all these assessments are in and of themselves valid, but just kind of incomplete. But I think that a lot of egalitarian political outlooks, a lot of like leftism and anarchism and related orientations and perspectives have tended simply to, make kind of like a blanket assessment of human nature based on psychological need, and then just assiduously refuse to engage in any kind of like meaningful scientific assessment of what human nature is, or to use just sort of like basic, intuitively apparent protocols for evaluating human possibility, like looking at what happens in different cultures and what it ultimately says about us and where the uniformities lie. And this is like essentially a fear reaction, and that this fear reaction, this insistence that humans, meet this certain mental schema that people want them to meet, and an unwillingness to engage in evidence has just like had all these really devastating consequences, and all these consequences that would have just been impossible to anticipate when people were in 20th century social sciences establishing this notion that there is no human nature out of like a leftist ideological conviction. I don't think any of those people could have anticipated how significant the effect of their work was going to be, and how dire. And so if I'm making a more, rigorous, more formal, certainly, body of theory, with like a glossary of terms, like that are analogous to, say, primitive accumulation or the dictatorship of the proletariat in Marxism, this is certainly the kind of project that's found in some echelons of politics more than others. It's definitely within the sphere of radically egalitarian politics. This is something that is far more common in Marxism than in anarchism. Anarchism really, as much as it is a very academic tendency in one sense, it doesn't actually feature a very extensive body of theory per se. It's been historically and currently just a much more practice-oriented phenomenon. And in his book, Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology, which we will rely on heavily in this episode, and which I really can't recommend strongly enough, it's very concise, and it goes over a lot of really, really compelling material. The anarchist and anthropologist David Graeber talks about this. He says, even if one compares the historical schools of Marxism and anarchism, one can see we are dealing with a fundamentally different sort of project. Marxist schools have authors, just as Marxism sprang from the mind of Marx. So we have Leninists, Maoists, Trotskyites, Gramscians, Althusserians, and then skipping ahead a little, now consider the different schools of anarchism. There are anarcho-syndicalists, anarcho-communists, insurrectionists, cooperativists, individualists, platformists. None are named after some great thinker. Instead, they are invariably named either after some kind of practice or, more often, organizational principle. Significantly, those Marxist tendencies which are not named after individuals, like autonomism or council communism, are also the ones closest to anarchism. Anarchists like to distinguish themselves by what they do and how they organize themselves to go about doing it. And indeed, this has always been what anarchists have spent most of their time thinking and arguing about. Anarchists have never been much interested in the kinds of broad strategic or philosophical questions that have historically preoccupied Marxists. Questions like, are the peasants a potentially revolutionary class? Anarchists consider this something for the peasants to decide. What is the nature of the commodity form? Rather, they tend to argue with each other about what is the truly democratic way to go about a meeting, at what point organization stops being empowering and starts squelching freedom, or alternately, about the ethics of opposing power. What is direct action? Is it necessary or right to publicly condemn someone who assassinates a head of state? I think that this is a really astute observation, and it certainly characterizes the approach that I've taken to politics throughout most of my life. I read the definition of anarchism in a dictionary when I was 10 years old and immediately said right then and there, that is my political philosophy. Good of an illustration as any of the fact that we come to our political orientations because of like baseline innate psychological dispositions that we possess, and all the elaborate argumentation that we bring to bear on those political orientations is very often a post hoc rationalization. I mean, obviously we can be more or less rational because we can be more or less willing to evaluate our psychological biases. But, it's a good illustration that is the square one place that we start from, is like an intuition, a sort of just like an innate inclination to orient towards certain stories about the human species and what should happen, what we should do over others. But I really stopped presenting myself overtly as an anarchist by the time I was 15, which was when I started really being interested in actually doing work in the world that would have concrete political results, because my orientation was simply that front-loading any approach to doing anything with a lot of ideology was just creating a basis for potentially infinite forms of conflict, and that, and it was coming from a perspective I think which is a perspective that this podcast is presenting a scientific basis for, and the innate differences between people that map to different political orientations. But it's just coming from a perspective that people are always going to have very radically different perceptions of what society should be and kind of what people are. And rather than try to reconcile all these differences, the fundamental question is always, where are points of convergence in perspective that are sufficient to be a basis for some kind of shared work or, collective form of organization of some kind or another. And so, most of what I've personally written tends to be concerned with exactly these kind of mid-level observations and theories that emerge very directly out of the practice of trying to accomplish something, like Graeber describes. My writing has been well, here's what we've learned about the speed at which police tactics evolve in this kind of uprising against the construction of fossil fuel infrastructure. And so if we wanted to have tactics that evolved faster than the police, we would have to have this kind of training structure in place. But that's kind of hard because before these moments of mobilization come, these kind of people don't really feel amenable to this kind, it's those kind of observations, and I have spent very, very, very little time writing or talking with anybody about things like what kind of society is ultimately possible, what are people, who, is hierarchy, inevitable, that kind of stuff has just not really characterized most of what I've ever called politics. And Graeber talks about this as well, this tendency to have a different relationship to the very notion of political theory, because one's political theory is really about finding consensus among different perspectives. So he says of an anarchist theory, clearly any such project has need of tools of intellectual analysis and understanding. It might not need high theory in the sense familiar today. Certainly it would not need one single anarchist high theory. That would be completely inimical to its spirit. Much better, I think, something more in the spirit of anarchist decision-making processes, employed in anything from tiny affinity groups to gigantic spokes councils of thousands of people. Most anarchist groups operate by a consensus process, which has been developed in many ways to be the exact opposite of the high-handed, divisive, sectarian style so popular amongst other radical groups. Applied to theory, This would mean accepting the need for a diversity of high theoretical perspectives, united only by certain shared commitments and understandings. In consensus process, everyone agrees from the start on certain broad principles of unity and purposes for being in the group. But beyond that, they also accept as a matter of course that no one is ever going to convert another person completely to their point of view and probably shouldn't try, and that therefore discussion should focus on concrete questions of action and coming up with a plan that everyone can live with and no one feels is in fundamental violation of their principles. One could see a parallel here, a series of diverse perspectives joined together by their shared desire to understand the human condition and move it in the direction of greater freedom. Rather than be based on the need to prove others' fundamental assumptions wrong, it seeks to find particular projects on which they reinforce each other. And, I do think that this is an essential sort of like basic framework in which to approach politics. I think that we can always find some scenario in which there's a clear basis for unity with anybody, right? If aliens attacked the Earth, then I would totally, and wanted to exterminate all of humanity or all other life on Earth or whatever, I would totally stand and fight with Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. I would against the aliens. And that's not the most pressing thing we have to concern ourselves with, but, it broadly illustrates that you can approach almost anybody from this perspective of like asking what we do in fact have in common that we would be willing to fight together for, and the answer is usually something. And any approach to a long-term social and political trajectory can take that basic framework as its foundation and be establishing consensus among people with really disparate perspectives by asking not whether they can reconcile all of their different ideas about the world, but just asking where the points of overlap are. But as much as a practical emphasis on finding consensus is, I think, a profoundly necessary, desirable approach to take with politics, I do think that the lack of explicit, well-developed, rigorous theoretical foundations in egalitarian political movements that, like outside of Marxism, essentially, like Graeber describes, ultimately is proving to be a bit of a disaster. What I see happening in practice is that with a tendency to orient away from a really explicit theoretical undertaking, social movements are left with a semi-coherent or pretty outright incoherent grab bag of assumptions and modes of reasoning and conclusions that came out of like various milieus that people are not even like super aware of or able to articulate, but that are still totally influencing their decision-making processes and how they interact. So I do think it's time for some high theory, but another point that I agree with Graeber about emphatically is that there's a pretty intrinsic relationship between the enterprise that became known as anthropology and, other forms of sort of like more overtly political analysis and political agitation. What he says is it's not so much that anthropologists embraced anarchism or even were consciously espousing anarchist ideas. It's more that they moved in the same circles. Their ideas tended to bounce off of one another. That there was something about anthropological thought in particular, its keen awareness of the very range of human possibilities, that gave it an affinity to anarchism from the very beginning. I think that's very well put. Ultimately, the enterprise of anthropology is about describing the range of human possibilities, which is inherently sort of the project of reform, is totally an essential component of any project of reforming society. So I guess that's another way of saying that I think actually a lot of the high theory that anarchism lacks is actually laying around. It's evolutionary theory and cross-cultural anthropological observation. It's cognitive science, right? It's all these other domains of inquiry. I think that when they're all synthesized into something coherent, that is like, when they're synthesized from the perspective, like I'm trying to do, of addressing, of actually like engaging in political realities and attempting to affect political outcomes here in the real world, then I think all of those various disciplines and all those various analytical approaches that we just kind of call different, dimensions of science, do in fact become the explicit theoretical foundations for a kind of politics that, I don't know, has the best shot of making the world, gives us the best shot at survival that we've got, however good or terrible that shot is. So if we're asking what kinds of societies are possible, we're implicitly asking, what is the range of variation that humans are capable of, behavioral variation that we're capable of, which is implicitly asking the question, what is the observed range of human behavioral variation, which is implicitly asking the question, what are the patterns of human life that have been observed not to vary? And, anthropologists have been asking this question in a variety of ways for a long time and coming up with different answers, but with a lot of overlap. And I thought, because it's fun more than anything, because ultimately these kinds of analyses get collapsed into a list. No matter how sophisticated your initial analytical approach is, you can always, at the end, come up with just like a list of things that you're claiming are universal to all human societies. So I thought it'd be fun just to give some sense of what these lists look like. This one is from 1945, so it's certainly not the most recent or probably not the most theoretically developed, but this is from Murdoch's The Common Denominator of Cultures. Age grading, athletic sports, bodily adornment, calendar, cleanliness training, community organization, cooking, cooperative labor, cosmology, courtship, dancing, decorative art, divination, division of labor, dream interpretation, education, eschatology, ethics, ethnobotany, etiquette, faith healing, family, feasting, fire making, folklore, food taboos, funeral rites, games, gestures, gift giving. And we're into the G's. I don't know if it's really all that necessary to complete the list, but it's a good illustration that we are talking about some very specific forms of behavior. These are non-trivial observations in most cases. Obviously anthropologists leave off of their lists of universals things like breathing and childcare, which are sort of just like biological or logical inevitabilities of human life. But, things like divination, is certainly not a logical inevitability of organized human existence. It's just something that has been found in every human society ever documented. So it must say something about the human mind, right? Dancing, very far from a logical inevitability of human life, but again, something found everywhere must say something about us. These kind of general lists can just be really interesting for establishing, first of all, the extent of the uniformities that are found in all societies, but then also how breathtakingly specific some of them are. My very favorite instance of this is from a different list, but from the book Human Universals, In this chapter titled The Universal People, Donald Brown says of, the universal people, this is supposedly something that we can safely infer about any human group that will meet in the future, based on every human group that's ever been observed so far. They have poetry in which lines demarcated by pauses are about 3 seconds in duration. Okay? The poetic lines are characterized by the repetition of some structural, semantic, or auditory elements, but by free variation too. So that's all pretty interesting to give some sense of like the scale of and the degree of specificity of some human universals, but I think it always is probably the most interesting to talk about those human universals which show like a pretty explicit, clear continuity with the behavior of other species. Because ultimately, a lot of the most just like salient facts about the human existence have a very, very clear relationship with the behavior of other species. The very fact that we live in groups, right? Anthropologists who are intent on establishing that there is no human nature and that cultures vary infinitely have tended to do this by, this intellectual paradigm of going to different groups, to different human groups, and establishing, often with very dubious methods, some radical deviation from what has typically been observed of human behavior, and then, claiming this is paradigmatic and illustrates that, there is no human nature and culture varies infinitely. But, of course, the very fact that anytime anthropologists are going to, find out what different people do and what they're all about, they're always going to groups, is in and of itself a very powerful illustration of human nature, because this is certainly by no means a logical inevitability of human life. We can totally conceive of a world in which humans just don't live in groups, and indeed many species don't. If wolverines had gained or bears or something had gained our cognitive capacities, if they had evolved our abilities for cognition before us, they wouldn't necessarily live in massive groups. It's not what they do now. The fact that within these groups we tend to particularly emphasize our families, people that we're closely related to. This is something that we have in common with, chimpanzees and baboons and many, many, many other species. And again, this is something where social scientists intent on establishing the infinite plasticity of humanity have tended to, look at different families in different cultures, different family structures, and say, look at how different these are. There's no human nature. But of course, the fact that they always find families everywhere is a powerful illustration of human nature. It's eminently logically conceivable that a society could exist where groups of people, like a child was produced, and as soon as there was no longer a physical need for it to be attached to any particular caregiver, no longer a need for it to nurse, essentially, that it would just be raised generally by the social group. But we never find this. We find variation in the extent to which non-family members help raise children, and variation in the extent to which family members other than a mother help raise children, but we never find a society in which families don't exist, in which children are simply raised by all members of the group equally, and where adults who are related to each other don't give each other some form of preferential treatment or have some greater degree of cohesion than they do with people that they're less closely related to. Then the fact that the groups that we live in are territorial, right? This is a central, chimpanzee life, baboon life, bonobo life is about living in groups that have territories, and in many cases it's about defending those territories, attacking members of groups in other territories, and this is just really a lot of what human life consists of too, right? It consists of identifying territorial groups and their relationship to other territorial groups and having disputes about territories. That's what war is, right? So you can look at, for instance, the current obsession with locking people up, including children at the United States border, and you can take like a leftist social constructivist approach and be like, well, to understand this, you have to understand these very specific narratives. This came about because of capitalism, which developed 400 years ago, but also there's white supremacy, which is a totally unique project in the history of the human experience, and that started, approximately 500 years ago, and like you can be like, and, like the way that narrative X spreads on the internet, blah, 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 or you can observe that this is territorial behavior, that this is a specific form of a much broader tendency to persecute people based on membership in different territorial groups and to prevent people from other territorial groups from entering territory. And then when you're liberated from these very specific narratives that supposedly are shaping all of human behavior, it starts to make a lot more sense why China, Turkey, and the United States are all kind of doing the same basic thing, just for instance. And then, of course, there are those universals of human societies that exist below or beyond certain technological thresholds, right? So there are some cross-cultural uniformities, for instance, of all hunter-gatherer societies. And so some of those are pretty interesting to describe because they both illustrate the general tendency of human universals to show similarity with the behavior of other species, but also how technology can create a framework for very significant variation in those behaviors. So things that all hunter-gatherer childhoods have in common with the developmental trajectories of all Old World monkeys and apes. This is called the Catarrhine mother-infant complex. It consists of 9 things. Hemochorial placenta, singleton birth, 24-hour, this is where it gets into actual behavior, 24-hour physical contact in first weeks, 24-hour proximity until weaning, nursing more than 3 times per hour while awake, night nursing until weaning, weaning at around 30% of the age of first ovarian cycles, separation from mother resulting in protest, and isolation rearing resulting in dysfunctional behavior. So every hunter-gatherer society ever observed has this like really significant level. I guess like the ones that I would note as the highlights are just the very, very significant level of contact and proximity between mother and offspring. And this is something that is certainly not found in all species. There's like a deer simply leaves their young somewhere and goes off to forage. And Old World monkeys and apes just don't ever do that. And hunter-gatherers just don't do that. And it has significant consequences when infants are left alone. And this is one regard in which technology really has radically reshaped our experience of being human. I mean, there's always a morality tale. Anytime that you talk about traditional societies, hunter-gatherer societies, anything below like a certain technological threshold, there's always like a morality tale playing out in people's heads, however explicitly they're acknowledging it or not, where it's like the ultimate question is, are societies that are less technological better or worse, right? Like this and I think thinking that simple and that reductionist does tremendous violence to the extraordinary complexity of the human experience. But there are certain regards in which I think it is actually pretty safe to make these kind of categorical distinctions. And child development and childhood in hunter-gatherer versus other societies is one of those domains where I think it's really unequivocal. The hunter-gatherer childhood model is like a general statement about what all hunter-gatherer childhoods have in common, and it's not based on it's not based on an infinite number of observations, but there's a significant number of cultures that have been studied and compared, the San people, the Hadza people, etc. There's a lot of elements of the hunter-gatherer childhood model that sound pretty outright utopian compared to what we experience. Children are given very, very little discipline or explicit instruction of any kind. They're kind of just allowed to develop behaviors by observation. And so, for example, in an ethnography on the Hadza, hunter-gatherers in Tanzania, Marlowe says, Hadza children are allowed to do as they like most of the time. Children throw tantrums and pick up sticks and hit adults who do little more than fend off the blows and laugh. And Marlowe's ethnography also has this amazing photograph of, I think it's a 2-year-old Hadza child smoking a cigarette around a campfire, and the cigarette is as big as the kid, it's an astonishing, because it's some hand rolled, it's this really giant cigarette, and then there's all these adults who are kind of watching and laughing. It's an amazing photograph. So hunter-gatherer childhoods, you get to smoke when you're 2. And then there's definitely the reality of being a childhood after your infancy of very constant close proximity and physical contact with your mother and other caregivers. Your childhood is typically spent in mixed age, mixed gender playgroups. So unlike the experience of development in more industrialized societies, where you're with a group of peers who are all about the same age, children in hunter-gatherer societies tend to hang out along a pretty significant age gradient, which allows so adults do very little instruction, but children learn things and then teach one another. So it's very, very common to see groups of children in which older kids are both essentially taking care of, essentially performing child care functions for younger children, but then also showing them how to do things and giving them instruction. And they're all playing various games in which the older children have skills, because they play games that have a very direct relationship to what they're going to do as adults. They tend to do things like play, let's make a play shelter, or let's have play sex, which again, they're allowed to do. There's very few restrictions. And then some groups of children in hunter-gatherer societies actually start doing a fair amount of their own. They hunt and gather a pretty significant proportion of their calories at very early ages, because it just is what there is to do. So on the one hand, they're allowed to kind of run wild, and their experience of instruction or authority is very often just other kids who are a few years older than them, which is a radically different experience than having an adult try to explicitly instruct you in the ways of adulthood. But then, in addition to all this freedom, they also actually get to develop a sense of competence and responsibility and kind of authenticity much earlier in a lot of ways. The tragic paradox of growing up in a society like ours is this simultaneous sense imposition of all these massive restrictions and profound responsibilities, but then also divesting young people of any sense of actual agency or actual functional competence in any domain of life whatsoever. And, in the hunter-gatherer childhood model, things are the inverse of that. There's a ton of freedom, but also a ton of there's, again, Marlowe's ethnography of the Hadza also describes children performing really complex tasks that are very significantly helpful to the adults at very, very early ages, because they like the sense of being good at things, and they like learning, and they want to develop into impressive functional beings. It's just it's a very different developmental context, and there can just be absolutely no doubt that it has very significant developmental consequences that we do not live as either our close primate relatives live or as all hunter-gatherers live in these very significant respects, that we do not have consistent proximity to mother and other caregivers during infancy, and that we are not allowed to actually develop on our own terms through observation and learning and given like free rein to do that, which is actually probably like just logically inevitable in a society as complex as ours. Like there is this core necessity for the hunter-gatherer childhood model to work for children to be able to observe what adults are doing and to realistically expect that they're going to do the same things as adults, and that's not really the society we live in now. And so that would make that model exceptionally difficult, and ethnographers have observed a transition even just with the introduction of fairly like technologically minimal subsistence agriculture. They've noted a linear decline in the amount of proximity, the amount of time spent nursing and the proximity of mother to infant as a society goes from hunting and gathering to like minimal subsistence agriculture. So, I think it is probably just, it's not like we can simply recapitulate the hunter-gatherer model in a technologically intensive society, but it is hugely useful to note that that the hunter-gatherer childhood model characterizes our developmental needs and is not something that we are currently experiencing. But then, of course, the cross-cultural universal that I think has the very most to do with kind of whether or not you would want to live in any given society, with the extent to which any given society maximizes human potential and happiness and all that other stuff, is hierarchy, right? The degree of hierarchy in a society is hugely predictive of many other aspects of that society. And so this is like for a kind of huge number of reasons. I mean, maybe most central is the simple fact that the experience of freedom itself is something that we are innately inclined towards and desire, but there's certainly any huge number of other reasons. We talked about in parts 1 through 3 how, hierarchy is maintained through the biology of aggression, and the biology of aggression is associated with behavioral rigidity. So you get to explore less possibilities and you are less capable of adapting to the very rapidly changing world that we live in if you are operating more in an aggressive behavioral paradigm. There's also the simple fact that because aggression doesn't invoke any particular reasoning process, societies that are constituted around the use of aggression more so than others just have a far greater capacity to be very stupid societies, to be dominated by people who think ridiculous things and don't really understand the world around them or the people in it very well at all. Graeber talks about this as well in a couple different books. In Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology, he says, "Such a theoretical emphasis opens the way to a theory of the relation of power, not with knowledge, but with ignorance and stupidity. Because violence, particularly structural violence, where all the power is on one side, creates ignorance. If you have the power to hit people over the head whenever you want, you don't have to trouble yourself too much figuring out what they think is going on. And therefore, generally speaking, you don't. Hence the surefire way to simplify social arrangements, to ignore the incredibly complex play of perspectives, passions, insights, desires, and mutual understandings that human life is really made of, is to make a rule and threaten to attack anyone who breaks it. This is why violence has always been the favored recourse of the stupid. It is the one form of stupidity to which it is almost impossible to come up with an intelligent response. It is also, of course, the basis of the state." So, what I want to establish is that hierarchy is innate. The human species, like most other species, certainly the ones that we're closely related to, is hierarchical, but also that there is very significant variation in the extent to which societies are hierarchical, and that this variation characterizes variation in kind of like how favorable or adverse those societies are, how amenable those societies are to human need, and the extent to which they create a framework for the maximization of human potential and the furtherance of human development. But so the statement that hierarchy is innate is the statement that it's observed pretty much everywhere, and this once again invokes this eternal morality tale that so many debates which have a surface of like a very sophisticated kind of like overt presentation, like very complex argumentation involving myriad facts, ultimately what's actually being debated is this incredibly simple, incredibly dualistic, like hyper-binary morality tale, which can be very concisely characterized as, like, were societies better or worse when there was less technology? Like, are people basically good or bad? Is technology like perfecting our species or ruining it? These like very, very simple notions about how the world works that are ultimately being debated even when people are, talking about homicide rates in the central Amazon versus like, mental health breakdowns in industrial societies, and like all this like pretty complex stuff. And there's just no way, there's no way we can't do this. I can't have a podcast about the relationship between biology and politics without sooner or later kind of like very directly addressing this. So we're gonna do that. We're gonna talk about how hierarchy is found everywhere, but more generally how misery and maladaptation are found everywhere. And you can do this a number of ways. Like you can be like David Graeber and just say very concisely, I think it's safe to say that humans have never lived in the Garden of Eden. Or you can be like Robert Edgerton and write an entire book that's hundreds of pages long called Sick Societies: Challenging the Myth of Primitive Harmony. And we're gonna read a few key passages from that. And so Edgerton's book is just like absolutely filled. I mean, it's basically just pages and pages of either high anthropological theory or just descriptions of some of the more lurid aspects of human behavior that have ever been recorded. And, they're very widespread cross-cultural distribution. And I do have to admit that there's like, just in terms of like personally, psychologically, my experience of encountering material like this is slightly gleeful in a way that is very analogous to how, as a young punk rocker, I totally reveled in descriptions of like American suburban life or like complacency and normalcy that were presented in the mainstream as venerable and ideal, as like dark and terrible and sordid and perverse. In the same way, like I find that theories or positions that reduce everything that's undesirable about the human experience to some like relatively recent ideological system, or to, like all the characterizations that are like the problem is capitalism, the problem is white people, whatever. Just like I find these like not serious positions at all. Like I feel like they just don't meaningfully address the actual scope and severity of the difficulties that we face, and therefore prescribe nothing meaningful about how to respond to it. And so, like, in that same way, like there's like this part of me that really leans into this as like a destruction of a very naive utopia that I think stands in the way of any sort of real work towards a better life for any of us. But life at all for any of us, but I swear that that's really not the reason that I want to read any of this. Like, what I want to touch on here is, like, what Edgerton spends so much time defending is the incredibly common sense notion that that societies can be better or worse for the people that live in them. And this is certainly one of those domains, and there are infinite illustrations of this general principle where it's like almost nobody seems capable of being quite as wrong as experts. Because if you just asked any layperson, like, are people happier in some societies than others? Are things better or worse in some human systems and situations than in others? People are gonna, look at you like you're a fucking idiot. Be like, of course, absolutely, of course there are. It is only people who professionally study humans in certain obscure academic departments who make the claim that culture so profoundly shapes our behaviors and experiences and perceptions that we can't make any assessment whatsoever of what things are like for people in any other culture. So Edgerton just spends a lot of time disputing this notion, and then, like, going through all these illustrations, all these different cases of cultures generating what can pretty clearly be perceived by outsiders as some very significant misfortune, adversity, and suffering, and saying, like, come on, you really think we can't say anything about how this is for these people? And so I want to start because the most committed epistemological relativists I've ever met in my life are not actually, like, social scientists or leftist critical theorists or whatever. It's actually, like, people who are really into herbal and other forms of traditional medicine who are the most committed to this principle, where they're like, no, you can't use science. It's hyper-reductionist and, like, a very specific Western way of looking at the world to evaluate the practices of other cultures, which is a really weird statement if your actual motivation is to say that we should take something that was done in that culture and apply it to ourselves. Like, oh yeah, we should use that traditional herbal remedy or whatever. Like, that would work for you. That is actually a very, like, explicit statement of cross-cultural applicability of a practice, but it's always justified with the inability for us to make any cross-cultural comparisons. Anyway, I don't know. I mean, obviously, that's a little bit of a digression. I'm not really trying to tear down herbal medicine in particular. That's just not my hill to die on. But yeah, I want to start talking about some medical practices that I think we can read about and say are unequivocally kind of bad. Because whatever else you want to say as a social construct or, like, is unknowable about the experiences of people who are living in different cultures, I think if something kills them, you can say that practice didn't really benefit them, right? So here's from Edgerton. After studying Apache shamans, Morris Opler concluded that the less he does, the better for the patient. The Yoruba of Nigeria treated convulsions in children with a tonic consisting of green tobacco leaves marinated in urine and sometimes topped off with gin. The decoction contained so much nicotine that children treated with it were often deeply unconscious when taken to a European hospital in Ibadan. And medical specialists in many small societies, including the technologically ingenious Inuit, were inept surgeons. So were the Maenge of highland Papua New Guinea, who had great need of medical skill as their almost incessant warfare left many men wounded, some gravely so. Yet according to Mervyn Meggitt, their medical knowledge and surgical skills were woefully inadequate. Many arrow wounds were simply left untreated, or else the shaft was pulled out, sometimes by the agonizing practice of tying it to a rafter until the suppuration of the wound and a friend's twisting of the arrow eventually worked it loose. Some grievously wounded men were also subjected to a surgical procedure that was more likely to hasten their death than their recovery. Acting on the Maenge belief that the wounded man's blood was contaminated, a specialist used a bamboo knife to make an incision under the victim's armpit, and then broke a rib with a wedge so that he could insert 2 fingers into the thorax, collapsing the lung in the process. He next poured water into the cavity and shook the patient vigorously to mix the blood and water. Finally, he rolled the patient over to drain out the mixture. Megid expressed surprise that some men actually survived both their wounds and this treatment. So, that's one case where it might be appropriate to discard cultural relativism and say, we can make some definitive statements that some of these medical practices simply aren't good for people, because if for no other reason, even if we're not assuming any continuity of experience per se, we can make the statement that if something kills somebody, it's not really great for them, right? So here is a basis by which we can say that some societies are better or worse for people in at least this particular regard. But I think that a much broader thing that we can do that is a counter to cultural relativism or whatever you want to call it is to simply ask people about their experience of living in a given society. Because this is the thing that so much of the social constructivist, epistemological relativist, whatever framing assumes that people who live in a given society don't have critiques of that society that sound awfully familiar to us in a lot like how we might feel about living in those societies, right? So this is any time that this hyper-academic language gets invoked where it's you're using a hyper-reductionist Western framework, you're imposing your cultural values onto a cultural system that exists in relation to such infinite human malleability that you literally can't understand what these people are experiencing, or whether this practice of female genital mutilation or this tendency for, males in this society to gang rape any woman who gets out of line and starts questioning her husband too much. You don't know what these experiences are like for these people. To do that, for as much as these same theorists might invoke a bunch of language about how the scientific approach supposedly invisibilizes people or negates the validity of their perspective, their approach really requires just not listening to people or taking what they say seriously about their own experience of living in their own societies. So, as Edgerton says, sometimes, however, evidence of people's dissatisfaction need not be inferred from their reactions to externally imposed change. Some people clearly, even passionately, say that they dislike their society's customs or feel guilty about taking part in them. Although men among the Cheyenne Indians of the North American plains sometimes gang-raped an errant wife as custom dictated, many said that they disliked doing so. Some Yanomamo Indians, whose culture exalted ferocity and perpetuated warfare, frankly admitted that they disliked having to live in fear of violent death. And Nisa, that outspoken Kung San woman, found much to criticize about San culture. I'm sorry, I can't do the click that I should have done when I said Kung. She even declared the ways of the San god were, quote, foul. Comparable examples can be drawn from the highlands of Papua New Guinea. Women among the Ma'aenge said that they detested the frequent warfare that the men engaged in, no matter how just the cause of the violence might have been. And according to Donald Tuzin, Elahit Ita Arapesh men openly admitted that they felt deeply shamed about their treatment of their sons during the physically painful and emotionally terrifying Tambaran initiation ritual. Tuzin also quotes an Elahita Arapesh man as follows: "It is true that sometimes men feel ashamed and guilty over eating good food while their wives go hungry." And Fitzjohn Porter Poole reports this about the Bimin Kuskosumin practice of cannibalism. Many Bimin Kuskosumin men and women who I interviewed and who admitted to socially proper cannibalistic practices acknowledged considerable ambivalence, horror, and disgust at their own acts. Many persons noted that they had been unable to engage in the act, had not completed it, had vomited or even fainted, or had hidden the prescribed morsel and had lied about consuming it. What is more, Poole observed that on the 11 occasions that he actually witnessed cannibalism among the Bimin Kuskosumen, they exhibited extreme reticence and ambivalence about the act. And then he also talks about instances in which people tried to change the practices of their societies, where there was conflict, where there was something very analogous to what we call in today's societies a movement against a certain practice. For instance, sometime in the early 19th century, Knife Chief, the political leader of the Skidi Pawnee and a greatly respected man, decided that human sacrifice was cruel and unnecessary. Whether he did so simply because he was a compassionate man or because he had been influenced by his occasional contacts with white Americans is not known. What is known is that he began to speak against the practice, and in 1817 he attempted to halt the sacrifice of a captive girl. Just before the torture of the young victim was about to begin, Knife Chief's son, by all accounts the most honored warrior among the Skidi Pawnee, stepped in front of the girl and declared that it was his father's wish that she be set free. As the Pawnee audience looked on in amazement, he freed the girl, threw her on his horse, and delivered her safely to her own people. A year later, father and son again prevented a sacrifice, this time of a 10-year-old Spanish boy, by ransoming the captive from a warrior who was determined to offer the child for sacrifice. As courageous, determined, and influential as Knife Chief and his son were, their efforts to put an end to the practice of human sacrifice failed. And then he again makes the point right after this that there is just variation in happiness between different societies. The preceding examples are meant to illustrate the fact that people in small, traditional societies object to some aspects of their culture, just as people do in complex, post-industrial societies like our own. If there were to be a worldwide opinion poll of people's satisfaction with their customs or their lives, it is very likely that people in various societies would express quite different levels of satisfaction. When Gallup's organization actually conducted such a poll in several Western European countries, that is what they found. And surveys in the United States have often reported substantial differences in verbal expressions of life satisfaction in different parts of the country, as well as among various age and ethnic groups. And then finally, if we're searching for, pretty objective metrics of whether or not societies are working for the people who inhabit them, we could do a lot worse than to look at suicide, right? If you find life in a given society so unbearable that you kill yourself, that's a fairly objective metric of like how that society is doing for people. So Edgerton also talks about this. However, it is not the case, as some anthropologists have declared, that suicide is always a rare event, nor one that offers no threat to a society's viability. Among the Bimin Kuskosumen of Highland Papua New Guinea, suicide occurs so often that, according to Poole, its genesis, prevention, and ultimate social costs are of paramount concern to the Bimin Kuskosumen. 10% of all deaths known to Poole during the 6 generations prior to his field research were due to suicide, and some suicides, such as those of children, may not have been reported. This is a dangerously high percentage and one that deeply troubled the Bimin Kuskosumen. What is more remarkable, during the 24 months of Poole's field research in the early 1970s, 30 of the 58 deaths that occurred, a startling 57% of the total, were suicides. In addition to these actual suicides, many people threatened suicide and others attempted to kill themselves but failed. Except for the rare altruistic suicide of a failed ritual leader or a heroic warrior, the Bimin Kuskosumen strongly deplored suicide and did everything they could to prevent it by making the actual act or the failed attempt highly stigmatizing. In spite of these measures, Bimin Kuskosumen killed themselves at an unprecedented rate. Most suicides were by men in the 23 to 34 age range who found the demands of their culture for manliness too great to bear. Strength, power, bravery, self-control, and influence over others were highly prized, and men who failed to meet these cultural standards for masculinity expressed resentment about the demands the culture put upon them. Women, who killed themselves less often than men, did so primarily because they were dissatisfied with the conditions of married life. As was noted earlier, many Biman Kuskusmen found their practice of ritual cannibalism repugnant. It is evident that an extraordinary number of these people found that life in Biman Kuskusmen society was not worth living. And then, of course, Sick Societies talks at pretty considerable length about really intense forms of hierarchy that existed in various small-scale traditional hunter-gatherer, etc. societies, and how profoundly adverse those hierarchies were for people living under them. Quote, "The use of coercive force by an individual or kin group against the rest of a society sometimes occurs even in small hunting and gathering societies. There are also accounts of a highly aggressive man or several related men attempting to dominate a hunting and gathering band in societies as diverse as the Inuit, Hadza, Australians, and San. However, these attempts to dominate are typically short-lived, as the remainder of the band either exiles the potential tyrant or kills him. Religious specialists, such as prophets or shamans, were sometimes able to exercise power over a majority of the society for longer periods." He also talks about the domination by men of women and children and the very real consequences that has for both groups. He gives a little bit of a review of how preferential access to food by men is a very common feature of many societies. In many such societies, choice, desirable foods were denied to women simply because men reserved them for themselves. In his review of food taboos, Frederick Samuns reported that after women among the Chukchi of Siberia had done all the work of slaughtering, butchering, and cooking reindeer, Chukchi men ate their fill, leaving only scraps and bones for the women. These men left no doubt about how they felt when they said, "Being women, eat crumbs." The Chukchi were hardly unique. Peter Freuchen observed that for the Hudson Bay Inuit, boiled meat was man's food, too good for women to have. Similarly, in many parts of Aboriginal Australia, women were not allowed access to food that men were especially fond of. Instead, the men ate alone, then threw what they could not eat to these women. These practices do more than signal male dominance. The impoverished diets of women in these and many other societies can have harmful health consequences. In societies and places as culturally different as India, West Africa, Morocco, and South America, women continue to be so regularly deprived of animal protein and fat that they and their children are more vulnerable than adult men to disease and death. A particularly macabre example comes from the foray of highland Papua New Guinea, where men so monopolized access to animal flesh that women and children sought to supplement their diets by eating the flesh of deceased relatives. As a consequence, they contracted Kuru, a deadly neurological disease caused by a slow virus communicated through cannibalism. In these societies and many others where men denied choice food to women, they sometimes sought to justify their actions by referring to religious ideology, taboos, or women's health, but very often there were no justifications, only a transparent sense of their superiority and their lack of concern for women's welfare. This same unconcern sometimes underlay practices such as foot binding, female genital mutilation, selling daughters into prostitution, gang rape, and wife beating. Another thing that Edgerton notes that tends to be generally true is a relationship between how externally aggressive a society is, how warlike it is towards other groups, and how internally oppressive it is, the degree of hierarchy within. And that this is true. This is like a correlated relationship that exists among other species as well, right? So like bonobos versus chimpanzees. Bonobos are both less aggressive towards people in neighboring groups, as well as less operating under a less intense dominance hierarchy within their own group. And, you know, it's like we can see this in our own society, certainly, you know, like 9/11 certainly set us up to live in a more, you know, to first of all be in a more overt form of external conflict at large, and then also to live in a more intense hierarchy with more idiotic despotism. And so he talks about this in traditional societies, talking about Highland Papua New Guinea here again. Highland Papua New Guinea is where, like, some really giant proportion of the world's known hunter-gatherers live. It's really like the Amazon, Papua New Guinea. Between those two places, that's like the vast majority. But yeah, Highland Papua New Guinea has a lot of particularly distinct cultural groups because it's all these really big, habitable valleys that are separated by terrain that's very, very difficult to pass through. So even though it's a relatively small area, all of these cultures developed in, like, relative isolation from one another. And so there's a tremendous linguistic and cultural diversity, and a lot of populations that maintained either like a pure hunter-gatherer lifestyle or at least like very, very little technology until very recently, or continue to do so. So anyway, he says about this relationship between despotism and external aggression in Highland Papua New Guinea. Warfare among these societies was so ferocious that entire populations were sometimes annihilated. In order to survive, a society needed a great war leader who could rally his own warriors to battle and recruit the survivors of decimated populations as allies. In this climate of unending warfare, political leaders became despots who ruled by ruthless intimidation. Such men took other men's wives and killed anyone who objected. Capable of every moral outrage, they were usually beyond the reach of public opinion because their people needed them. Some of these despots ruled for over 20 years, and although they ran roughshod over the people they led, they also defended them against their enemies in a world where death and war was an ever-present threat. And we can certainly also talk about other external conditions that make that tend to intensify hierarchy or make despotism more inevitable. And certainly, like all hunter-gatherer societies are often characterized as being more egalitarian than other types of society. And this is like generally pretty true, but even within hunter-gatherers, we sometimes see even lacking agriculture, the ability to accumulate surplus, which does seem like a really key variable. It is true that as populations develop agriculture in the archaeological record, then they also start exhibiting all these more like elaborated and intensified forms of hierarchy. They start developing like a class system, basically, that's very easy to detect. But even a famous example is the Kwakiutl and Ruth Benedict's Patterns of Culture, which is one of the more famous books of anthropology that was ever produced. And whatever one thinks of the theoretical underpinnings of the book, it's really interesting. Even though I don't agree with Patterns of Cultures, like a lot of the primary conclusions, I do actually think it's a really interesting approach. What she essentially does is she talks about individual personality variation in temperament, as she puts it, and then she talks about how different cultures seem to represent like formalizations and collectivizations of what can be thought of as like different personality types, basically. And there's a lot there that doesn't make a ton of sense, but it's a pretty interesting approach. But anyway, she talks about the Kwakiutl who subsisted off of fishing salmon, which they would dry, which gave them, because salmon were such an abundant food where they lived and they had a way to store it, it gave them a basis for the accumulation of surplus, for that baseline like requirement for hyper elaborated like hierarchies, like elaborate like state structures and aristocracies that we mostly see once cultures cross over to agriculture. But the Kwakiutl very much had like they had slavery, which a number of hunter-gatherer societies had, but they definitely had like an aristocracy, a very elaborate system of titular classes, and massive inequalities between a small ruling class and the majority of the population. But then, yeah, once you toss agriculture in the mix and the capacity for hierarchical intensification that it implies, you do get just like whole new levels of inequality, and therefore it would appear suffering that you really just kind of can't achieve in hunter-gatherer societies. But yeah, with the emergence of agriculture and states, you get things like the Aztec Empire, which I was pretty amazed to recently learn, like I always knew that they killed a lot of people, but I recently read that the range of estimates for their like annual human sacrifices are 15,000 to 250,000, and there's a hypothesis, and I don't know, and neither does any academic know if the hypothesis is true, but there's a hypothesis circulating out there that is like a purely nutritional interpretation of Aztec cannibalism. See, here's a little fragment of that. Michael Harner and Marvin Harris have argued that this cannibal kingdom developed because population growth, along with progressive degradation of the always limited sources of wild and domestic animals, mostly turkeys, wildfowl, deer, rabbits, dogs, and other small animals, in the Valley of Mexico, left the Aztecs critically deprived of animal protein. And whether or not this hypothesis is true, the fact that it's like remotely plausible that we can say like, well, maybe they were killing people for like, purely ritual purposes, purely as a manifestation of the core sort of like hierarchical impulse. Or maybe they were killing people because there just wasn't enough to eat. I just think that is a powerful illustration of the extent of the carnage. But okay, that's probably enough of that. We've probably spent enough time, surveying the catalog of horrible things that people have done over time and across space. We could hopefully say now that we have established that people do some pretty terrible things over time and across space, cross-culturally. But the important thing to note, so that takes us out of the realm of like naive utopian like idealization of humanity when humanity exists outside of some contextual variable that supposedly causes all evil. But now, like, the point remains, the thing that there is to assess, if we are willing to acknowledge the sort of baseline imperfections of our species, or whatever you want to think of it as, is that there is very significant variation between cultures in how hierarchical they are in particular, or in how miserable they seem likely to make people in general. And that would be, like in the document that I said that I was making at the beginning of this podcast, the running list of principles, or the glossary, or whatever it is, the list of axioms. That's probably what I should say. That sounds good and formal. The thing that I would add to it from this episode is this notion that hierarchy is both innate, but also hierarchy is destructive, and also hierarchy is variable. So that, this general premise that we do in fact see hierarchy everywhere, and that the more of it we see, the worse off people seem to be. And also, there does seem to be a very realistic conversation to have about diminishing it. And that, again, just like isn't all that shocking, because of course, like we can look around, we can reference obscure anthropology that involves far-flung cultures and exotic locales, or we can just look around the world we actually know and be like, well, yeah, of course, the societies that we're directly familiar with do vary actually quite massively in the extent of hierarchy that's present, like North Korea versus Sweden versus, like it's different, right? And so looking at the world this way, I think really tends to, and again, this is precisely antithetical to the project of cultural relativism, and to all the social science constructs that want to make people existing in different cultures, want to make them beings who exist in mutually incomprehensible universes. But like looking at the world this way tends to diminish the sense of there having been some decisive rupture, or there being something totally like incomprehensibly radically different about people living in Highland Papua New Guinea or the Amazon or 2,000 years ago or whatever from ourselves. Like the supposedly decisive break between modernity and whatever it was that preceded modernity, or however you want to think of this, the decisive break between people living in traditional societies as opposed to people living in societies that get called things like post-industrial or whatever. And so this is a point that Graeber makes extensively. This is a lot of what Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology is concerned with, is establishing this notion that there's really actually no decisive break, that people everywhere are kind of pretty similar, having pretty similar experiences, and that societies, that there is hierarchy everywhere, but that societies that are less hierarchical are such because of conscious efforts that people take to diminish hierarchy, that there's an active tension between an always present hierarchical impulse and the observation of people living in a given society that impulse is destructive and makes life miserable, and, you know, like a conscious sort of like counter tendency that is embodied in their culture against those behaviors and practices. And one way to think about those statements is to say that there have probably been things roughly analogous to social movements throughout the entire history of humanity, that cultures have actually been shaped by conflicts and around values and orientations that are actually like really, really, really similar ultimately to conflicts that shape our own societies. So Graeber says, "This is what I mean by an alternative ethics, then. Anarchistic societies are no more unaware of human capacities for greed or vainglory than modern Americans are unaware of human capacities for envy, gluttony, or sloth. They would just find them equally unappealing as the basis for their civilization. In fact, they see these phenomena as moral dangers so dire they end up organizing much of their social life around containing them." And so then he gives some instances of like really egalitarian societies, but he talks about all of the different ways that their societies aren't simply like perpetual expressions of harmony where hierarchy isn't present, but actually these like very tense situations where hierarchy is kind of always being negated and explicitly like addressed, and explicitly or implicitly addressed in some way. And then he also talks about how particularly egalitarian societies seem to have this real tendency to conceptualize the actual universe, like to have a cosmology that very much involves all this like nightmarish conflict, and it's almost as if they're transferring human tendencies out of the corporeal realm and into like a conceptual cosmological one. So he says, case 1. The Piaroa, a highly egalitarian society living along tributaries of the Orinoco, which ethnographer Joanna Overing herself describes as anarchists. They place enormous value on individual freedom and autonomy and are quite self-conscious about the importance of ensuring that no one is ever at another person's orders, or the need to ensure no one gains such control over economic resources that they can use it to constrain others' freedom. Yet they also insist that Piaroa culture itself was the creation of an evil god, a two-headed cannibalistic buffoon. The Piaroa have developed a moral philosophy which defines the human condition as caught between a world of the senses, of wild pre-social desires, and a world of thought. Growing up involves learning to control and channel in the former through thoughtful consideration for others and the cultivation of a sense of humor. But this is made infinitely more difficult by the fact that all forms of technical knowledge, however necessary for life, are, due to their origins, laced with elements of destructive madness. Similarly, while the Piaroa are famous for their peacefulness, murder is unheard of, the assumption being that anyone who killed another human being would be instantly consumed by pollution and die horribly. They inhabit a cosmos of endless invisible war, in which wizards are engaged in fending off the attacks of insane, predatory gods, and all deaths are caused by spiritual murder and have to be avenged by the magical massacre of whole, distant, unknown communities. Yeah, and so Graeber talks about the revolutionary notion of counterpower, the idea that, that revolutionaries talk about a lot, like as a form of power that exists in distinct opposition to the forms of power, the overt capacity for violence, hierarchical control, etc., that states exhibit, and says that what we kind of see is that in highly egalitarian societies that we observe throughout the cross-cultural record, counterpower, as revolutionaries describe it in modern contexts, post-industrial contexts, etc., is the dominant form of power in the society. So again, this very active tension between hierarchy and non-hierarchical forms of social organization, and therefore the notion that something like social movements has occurred over and over again in the history of all these different societies to produce the specific forms that they take. And again, this is very much a paradigm, a mode of reasoning that integrates us into the broader story of humanity rather than creating these irreconcilable self-contained universes that we all supposedly live in. As he says, what I am proposing essentially is that we engage in a kind of thought experiment. What if, as a recent title put it, we have never been modern? What if there was never any fundamental break, and therefore we are not living in a fundamentally different moral, social, or political universe than the Piaroa, or Tiv, or rural Malagasy? And then to ground this conversation really clearly in not just innateness, not just in generalizations about innateness, hierarchy appears to be an innate human tendency because it's everywhere or whatever, but in variation in innateness, because that seems to be really the most crucial missing element of most of these discussions. We can talk about all these different societies we see where that have really despotic tendencies as just kind of instances in which the innate range of variation in orientations towards the dominance hierarchy and the other really powerful variations that we've talked about between people, for instance in episode 6, was it, when we talked about variations in degrees of empathy and people who essentially just lack empathy altogether, some of the psychological constructs like the dark triad, the tendency to both totally lack empathy and to either be extremely calculating and manipulative, Machiavellianism, or very impulsively self-aggrandizing narcissism, and how these are in fact psychological constructs which are far more commonly distributed among the very powerful than they are in the population at large. And so we can kind of look at different societies that have really despotic features and see them as societies where these people who are always going to show up in any given population just really kind of got their way. They undertook some sort of conflict with people who naturally, as I think most of us would, we're like, absolutely not. I do not want to live under your authority. I don't want you to possess most of the resources that my society possesses, and I don't want our social world to be constituted around you and your interests and desires. You know, like when those people lost, and people who have like a very particular perceptual and behavioral paradigm kind of just won in those conflicts. Like if we look at societies with vastly different like technological modes and or utterly disparate like formal ideological systems, you know, if we look at societies where it's like Stalin is in charge, Trump is in charge, this is the Aztec Empire, this is Egypt, you know, like we look at Egypt and like what we're ultimately seeing is a society in which a tiny minority controls the vast majority of the wealth and exhibits very strict control over most people, has slaves and things like that. And the reason that like the projects that intense hierarchy is constituted towards are things like building monuments towards those rulers, bringing, you know, like producing massive sculptures of their faces and things like that, building the pyramids, right, which were after all monuments to individuals. We can see like a pretty essential continuity with an entity like Trump. And, you know, like these people do all share some very basic tendencies, a tendency towards a total lack of empathy, a tendency towards like an obsession with domination, and very often like a real lack of understanding of the world around them or the people in it. Like a generalized tendency towards idiocy really is a very recurrent feature of authoritarianism. So that makes what we observe in the cross-cultural record really make sense. If we think about all the variation towards hierarchy, variation in empathy, all these other measures that we've described in other episodes, and then we think about any given society being a group of people, whether it's like a hunter-gatherer band of 50 people, or whether it is the Egyptian Empire, any given society being a group of people where those personality types and those perceptual paradigms are distributed at whatever rate in the population, and those people always being the kind of people who are going to seek power, we can see all this cross-cultural variation as variation in the extent to which people like that one, or the extent to which other people with better ideas manage to create a cultural system that existed in kind of constant opposition to the constant attempts of people like that to take and consolidate power and create inequality. So I guess what I'm saying is that if it is the necessary belief to be a revolutionary that a better world is possible, I think that this is true, but I think it's a quantitative statement. I think that what the cross-cultural record indicates is that at the very least, societies will always exist as a dynamic opposition to the ever-present threat of everything we don't like that we see in human societies. And so acknowledging this comes at a cost, right? This comes at a psychological and emotional cost. It involves acknowledging A, that we probably never were perfect, and B, we don't appear to be heading towards perfection anytime particularly soon. But there's a trade-off here for, you know, as is always the case in every domain, whether it's an aspect of your personal life that you don't want to come to terms with or an aspect of the whole human condition, there are always very severe consequences for refusing to engage with realities that make you uncomfortable and choosing to construct narratives that have little to do with reality but make you feel better. There is always some tragic and usually very unforeseeable consequence of that. And so the sort of reflexive emotional tendency that people who want to live in a better world have exhibited so recurrently in so many supposedly radically disparate ideological realms to simply disengage from any discussion about humans doing terrible things to one another or living in clearly stupid and maladaptive ways, even if they weren't, living under whatever your version of the recent evil that supposedly fell out of the sky and made human life so difficult is, whether that's capitalism or whatever, white supremacy, etc. When we acknowledge the relative ubiquity of adverse human tendencies, it hurts. But if we don't acknowledge human nature, then we end up, as a logical inevitability, as much as it might not appear clear that this is going to be true at the outset, we end up crafting a way of looking at the world that overstates, because it forces us to say that culture shapes everything. We end up being required to overstate the differences that exist between people in different cultures, and this has the effect of forcing us to inhabit a system where it is very, very easy to see differences between people and very, very difficult to see what we all have in common. And an understanding of what we all have in common, the common interest we have in achieving some very baseline necessities for the continued survival of our species, these commonalities get lost, and the loss of a sense of shared interest and the tendency to focus on perceived differences between people really is the history of social movements. And since social movements have been doing a whole lot of failing for a long time, it's the history of why social movements so recurrently and reliably fail. And that's what we're going to talk about next time. So the series, it's constituted around these two questions. Why are social movements so divisive? What kind of societies are ultimately possible? We touched on the introduction of the idea of cultural determinism, the idea that there is no human nature in the first part of the series. This time, we really just spent some time talking about what is possible and what is universally true of humans. And in the next one, we're going to really go into the development of that social science paradigm of infinite human malleability and absolute cultural determinism, and talk about how it evolved over the course of the 20th century, how it kind of because human nature does exist and because there's all these very easy analytical procedures for demonstrating different aspects of human nature, the project of social determinism took on all of these unexpected analytical modes and had to defend all of these unexpected conclusions, and how it developed a process of reasoning and a set of axioms and statements about the world that diffused out of academia and into social movements, and indeed characterize the dominant modes of reasoning, discourse, strategization, that social movements use, and the forms of unity that social movements perceive as possible. And hopefully that'll be soon. I have the episode all outlined. I've done all the research, so I just have to record it. So until that time, friends, thank you so much for listening, and we will talk again soon.